Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's very good to see so many of you back. And we, having gone global, we are now talking European. And I have an excellent panel with me. I'm not going to give their full bios because they are already extraordinarily well known and you want to hear from them and not me. But on my right, I have Erik Jones, Director of the Robert Schuman Centre at EUI in one of the most beautiful places in the world, which, for those of you who don't know, is in Fiesole in the hills above Florence. So he has a difficult job. And on my left, I have Baroness Claire Fox, Director of the Academy of Ideas and well known for her work on Brexit, who works in the House of Lords, which is quite nice too, but still not Florence. And on down the line, we've got Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive of the European Policy Centre, and he's in Brussels, enough said. Now, we're talking about matters European, and I want to just open with a rather general question, which inevitably is parochial, but I promise you I'll move it on beyond that, which is how is the EU changing without having the UK as a member state? Claire, do you want to start?
I think it's really quite difficult to know whether the EU has changed substantially since the UK has left, because the UK left. Because since effectively Brexit only really happened, not very long ago. It's not the 6 years anniversary in some ways. I think that some of the changes that we've seen are from other events. So one of the things that I wouldn't mind us having a bit of a chat about is what we learned about the EU during the COVID period, because I thought that brought out some strains and stresses in relation to the apparent harmonious unity of the European Union. There was definitely tensions. We've also heard this morning, I think it was Helen, or earlier on, that Helen made the point, which I think came around with the vaccine rollout, but Helen made the point about energy, which is you have nation states fighting their own corner rather than a kind of a collective approach. I think that the only other comment I'll make at this point is that the Ukraine situation has also revealed something, which is that in the build-up to and subsequent to the referendum, the people that I knew who were most enthusiastic about the European Union staying in, and then again when I had my very brief moment in Brussels as an MEP, if you said that you were pro-nation state, that you believed in national borders, that sovereignty was a hugely important concept, you were told, more or less, that you were some kind of mad dinosaur who was not up with the programme, that borders weren't that important, the nation states had to recognise a kind of globalist world and so on and so forth. That was the argument. But, when we talk about Ukraine, we then notice that sovereignty is the one thing that the Ukrainians are fighting for, that their borders suddenly do matter, and that we're all told that this is the forging of a new nation state, and that nation state, even earlier on, must be able to make decisions about what kind of peace it has. It can't be imposed by someone else. And I think, there we go. Fair enough. That must have a kind of existential impact on the federalist project in relation to the EU, I'd have thought. Not because of Brexit, but Brexit lurks there in the background.
Fabian, impact on the federalist project?
Yeah, I think one of the effects certainly I've seen is that the debate in the UK has removed itself even further from the realities of the European Union since Brexit. There seems to be very little understanding in some quarters of what is actually happening in Europe, what the underlying processes are like, and that in the end, despite the challenges which are there, and those challenges are tremendous, and Brexit is by far not the most important one in those, that overall, that cooperation in a much more contested world, in a world with very significant global instabilities, the European Union has become more important rather than less important. I think there is a reflection also on the impact the UK leaving has on the European Union, certainly in some policy areas. There is a negative impact. There are also positive impacts. For example, when we look at the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which for the first time allowed borrowing at the European level, this, in my view, wouldn't have been possible with the UK still as a member state. Equally, on some of the vaccine procurement, I cannot see how that would have worked with the UK inside. So it is a much more balanced picture. But my broad conclusion would be that, frankly, the EU has moved on from Brexit. Brexit, which was never the most important issue on the agenda, but it certainly has become a rather minor issue within the discussion. And the focus is now much more on how do we deal with the fundamental challenge which comes from Russia, from this changing global situation, and how do we ensure that cooperation within the European Union functions to address these challenges, because it is a tremendous challenge we have to address. It is a Zeitenwende, a watershed moment, which doesn't mean everything will be different from now on. But certainly Brexit is a minor consideration now.
And just on that point, just before I move on to Erik, do you want to just say anything about the EU's response to the UK government's tabling of the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which I learn at lunch from our wonderful colleagues in Westminster is going to get its second reading on Monday?
Well, the EU, in a sense, has provided the Commission with the ongoing support that it is the Commission which deals with the agreements which are there. But there is also a broader subtext which is present not only in the institutions, but as far as I can see, in all of the capitals. And I would not exclude, as some commentators in the UK have done, the Baltics or Poland. Actually, the EU member states continue to be very united on the issue of Brexit. That this simply is not acceptable, that this is a breach of international law, that this is a way of torpedoing the cooperation which is there, and that if the UK insists on doing this purely for internal political reasons, nothing to do with the actual issues in Northern Ireland, then there will be a response, and that response is going to be determined because in the end, this is an agreement which has been freely signed by both sides. It is a commitment which has been made, and there's an expectation that any country will fulfill its commitments which have been entered into.
Okay, thank you very much. Erik, go back to the basic exam question, which is what effect has the Brexit had on the EU working together?
So first I should start out that from my accent, it's probably hard to realize I've been living here since 1988. And in the arc of those 25 years, the way that the European Union has been organized from a European community to a European Union has changed quite significantly. And the language with which we understand the European Union has changed quite significantly as well. And worst of all, we use the same words to mean very different things depending on where we are, okay? So if you're in Belgium and you're a federalist, that means you want to decentralize political authority, right? Not centralize it. So Belgians not only love federalism, and they love sovereignty. So when they decentralized political authority with their constitutional change in 1993, they gave to the regions specific powers, including the power of procurement. And so the Belgian Walloon region was supposed to buy some buses. It had two different bids on the contract. One was from a Flemish firm that made buses, and the other was from a French firm that spoke French. And so, of course, they gave the contract to the French firm. And when the Flemish firm came in and said, you know, this is not right, you can't do this under European procurement rules, the Belgian state stopped and said, wait a minute, we can't solve this problem because the regions are sovereign in this regard. And so they passed the Van Hol bus case down to the Walloon region, and the Walloon region said, no, actually, we did everything right when we looked at this the first time, so that's the way it is. Now, that notion of federalism and sovereignty is actually really important because I think that if I were to look at the early response to the pandemic, what I would see is the reassertion of national sovereignty. The Italians are saying, they're going, you got to help us. And the Germans are saying, we're going to count all of our respirators and make sure we're not sending emergency medical equipment outside of the country. That's the discovery that we made, was that despite all the rhetoric about open markets and free movement, what we ended up with were national governments that behaved like national governments. And so what they needed to do was to say, is this really the best way to respond to a pandemic? And quite quickly, they did two different things. One was that they empowered national governments to keep doing what they were doing. So they relaxed the rules on competition policy, for example. They relaxed the rules on fiscal policy. They did that almost instantly. And the other thing is they said, OK, now that we've relaxed the rules and let you be able to do these things as national governments, now we need to figure out a way to make sure that you don't make the situation worse by doing so. And so then they introduced common procedures for procurement that allowed them to make sure that they weren't actually competing against one another and driving up the price for everybody loses, which is what we did in the United States at the state level, because we have the same sense of sovereignty that the Europeans have. It's just that it's operated by even dumber people than there are on the continent. And the reason that I want to tell that story is because when we think about European integration, there is this notion of sovereignty that they keep insisting on, right? Which is European sovereignty and strategic autonomy. But that's not meant to be a sovereignty that takes away from the member states. It's meant to be a pooling of decision-making resources so that they are powerful enough to stand up to the tech giants. That's why European sovereignty is listed in the commissioning letter for Margrethe Vestager, whose responsibility for competition and tech, right? She's not the nuclear defense lady. She's the competition and tech lady. They need her to be able to express sovereignty because the firms she's taking on have turnovers that are larger than anything Europe has ever had to deal with. And what we're looking at right now is ways that they can do that in the context of geopolitics. That's going to be a lot tougher, because sovereignty vis-a-vis Google is nothing compared to sovereignty vis-a-vis Putin. And we're figuring that out.
Well, thank you. And there's a question come in, and I would urge you all to use the Slido to submit your questions, but which joins up some of the dots. And the question is from Ralph Cunningham, who says, is being sovereign and an EU member state mutually exclusive because Ukraine wants to be both? So do you want to start with that, since you were touching on the different meanings of sovereignty? So
all member states are sovereign, right? If you go back to the March 2017 white paper on Brexit that Theresa May circulated, there's this wonderful line in it that says, of course, we were always sovereign when we were member states of the EU. It's just sometimes it didn't feel that way, right? And to give you the counterexample, my accent is a little weird. I come from Texas. Texas joined the United States, right? And then 12 years later decided that wasn't such a good idea and tried to leave. And they were conquered, their political leadership was replaced, and they were reintegrated into the country, right? That's what it means not to have sovereignty. And that's not something that any European Union member state will ever face. If anyone wants to leave, they can leave. It's just hard, right? It's just hard.
Claire?
I think that sovereignty is compromised by being in the European Union. It is also the case that because I respect the sovereignty of other countries, if any country wants to join the EU, I'm not going to say that they shouldn't be allowed to. I might not think it's a good idea, but, you know, Ukraine wants to join, that's fine with me. If they're a sovereign state, that's the deal. I think that the way that sovereignty feels strained, I mean, this is not an issue that I think that we need to be concerned with now, because we have actually left the European Union, but would be if you look at, for example, what's happening with the tensions around countries like Poland and Hungary, where they are basically told that they'll be fined because they're not sticking to the rules that the EU dictate, even though they had national elections where the priorities in those countries were different to those which the European Union considers its core values. And so that's why you have tensions around sovereignty. It was interesting that Fabian made the point in relation to the the thorny question of the protocol, he made the point, that the protocol was being sort of done for, that the UK government were doing things in the interests of for domestic audiences. Why were they doing that? Well, the whole point is that and not in the interest of the Northern Irish people. The point is Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. That's the whole problem, in a way. And if it's therefore treated separately or differently, then that does compromise the sovereignty question. And that's one of the reasons why the protocol bill is even on the table, so as to defend that. But at the heart of sovereignty, of course, is that you have, as an electorate, as a citizenry, as a national citizenry, you have your politicians accountable for decisions that they make, that you have the ability to cancel them, get rid of them, vote them out, which you do not have if decisions come to you from the European Union. Even if those decisions are ones that you like, that you support. I mean, often when I was in the, it's not that everything the EU does I don't like. They might well have a policy that I prefer to what my fellow citizens think, but I can't cheat in a democracy. My point is, they've got a better policy than the one we've got, but I have to be able to persuade my fellow citizens of the virtues of that, not say you've got no choice, it's coming from Brussels. That's, for me, what the whole issue of Brexit was always about.
So can I just push you a bit further on the sovereignty issue? Because if you take the sovereignty debate to its logical conclusion, it means not only leaving the EU, but also leaving the Council of Europe, and dare I say, even the WTO. So why is it we haven't gone down that route?
Well, I think that there are question marks about the use of transnational organisations as a way of ring-fencing off decision-making from the electorate. I mean, that's effectively where the nervousness is about a number of international organisations. I think those issues might well come to the fore, and I certainly think that the World Trade Organization, there may well be questions, but there's all sorts of ways it happens. I mean, even with the World Health Organization recently, where there's been an argument that there should be a deal signed by everybody that would say that there will be the use of lockdowns if there's ever a pandemic again, that everyone will sign up to it. These are things which then get removed from any kind of democratic accountability. So I think there is a question mark there. But where I would disagree is the idea that this is an isolationist position. For me, it's a democratic position, because the implication was Fabian actually made the point when, the UK is now further removed from understanding what's happening in the EU. Well, that's partly the deal, which is that I'm not, so what, that was the deal, right? I'm like, fine, get on, carry on, do your bit. But what it does not mean is that you can't have cooperation. I mean, we should be able to and can have international cooperation without signing up to international treaties. It is also the case that you can, and because people keep referring interchangeably between the EU and Europe, and I would just say that I consider myself to be European. I am pro-European and pro-solidarity with European countries, and actually have been very interested in what's happening in Ukraine way before it became fashionable to be interested in what's happening in Ukraine and they weren't in the EU. I mean, I was kind of have mates there and have been following the situation for some time. I didn't go, oh my God, you have to be in the EU or out there. I mean, I just was interested in that region. That's the way I look at politics.
Thank you. Fabian, can I just turn to you? Clearly, you're still a national of a country which has surrendered sovereignty to the EU. Is that how you...
Shared, not surrendered. I didn't say surrendered.
Compromised. I think first I wanted to just pick up one point from what Claire just said. I think this idea that you can have meaningful international cooperation between sovereign states without signing international treaties, I find a bit of an illusion. I cannot see anywhere in the world where that is the case. International cooperation is based on international treaties which are signed by those states which want to cooperate. All of the institutions we've talked about are based on those kind of treaties. Yes, the European Union is a different beast. It has different types of institutions. But the idea that you cannot sign up to international cooperation if you don't sign up to treaties essentially is an isolationist policy, because you cannot have meaningful cooperation if that is the case. On sovereignty, frankly, I don't share the obsession with sovereignty. I think, in my view, most of the population doesn't share that obsession with sovereignty. They care about other things. They care about accountability. They care about effectiveness. They care about what is being delivered. But abstract political or legal notions, in my experience, don't carry very high importance when people make decisions. But even if you look at that, I completely disagree with the characterization that European countries somehow have compromised their sovereignty. I find it interesting that apart from the UK, all other countries, despite the problems, despite the debates which are there, seem to be according to Claire, in the illusion that they are fully sovereign nations who make sovereign decisions, who are also fully democratic. And I find it a bit problematic to make this assumption that just because they have joined an international organization, somehow they have compromised their own decision-making power or their own legal power. On top of that, I think the reality is that we live in a world where sovereignty, and I mean here not legal sovereignty, but effective sovereignty, is constrained by the environment in which we live in. And this is precisely why a country like Ukraine knows full well that by joining the European Union, it does not give up sovereignty, it gains sovereignty. It has the ability to defend its sovereignty by cooperating with other nations which have the same degree of importance put on making their own decisions, defending their own values, defending their own interests. And of course, this will not always be a harmonious discussion. There will be differences in opinion, there will be differences in interests, and that will have to be sorted out. But that's exactly why we have created a mechanism where we can sort out those issues between sovereign nations within a framework where we end up having those negotiations at a conference table rather than on a battlefield.
Thank you. So just before I move on to my next question, a brief commercial break to say, I'm sure you're aware of our State of the EU report, which is published today. It's marvellous. Don't just look at Anand's brief summary of it on Twitter. There's far more rich things in the report. Please read it. That brings me to my next question, which is we've looked at the question from a rather parochial basis. What's the effect of the UK leaving the EU? What I'd like to look at now is obviously Ukraine has already come up in the conversation, but the quite remarkable changes that we're seeing in the EU at the moment over common foreign and security policy. Erik, do you want to tell us a bit about where you think this is heading? Do you think this is sustainable? And picking up on one of the questions that come in, if the EU is going to have a proper common foreign and security policy, does that mean far more centralisation of power and greater political accountability in the EU institutions?
So I think that's a really good question, because if you imagine Europe as being some kind of military entity, right, with an army and Joint Chiefs of Staff and some political leadership to say go fight there or don't go fight there type thing, that's heavy lift, right? I don't see the Austrians buying into that. You know, the Irish, not so much. You know, we can get the Swedes and the Finns into NATO. Well, if Turkey will let us, but we can do that. But forging some kind of really effective, I'm going to send the troops abroad, I just don't see it. the best, when you talk to Europeans about defense cooperation, the best that you can usually get out of them is a sense of what we're going to do is coordinate defense procurement. We're going to enhance interoperability of defense systems. We're going to strengthen our industrial capacity to meet sudden needs. And along the way, we're going to reduce our dependence on foreign suppliers of critical components so that we don't find ourselves caught on the hoof, right? There's a brilliant book you should read by John Allen and Ben Hodges called Future War and the Defense of Europe, and it looks at the amount of effort that would have to go in for Europe to replace the United States as decision maker in chief in all this foreign and security policy type stuff, okay? And I just don't see that happening. I just don't. I'm struggling to cry over that because I don't think that would be a good thing for European integration. I think it would be a bad thing for European integration if Europe tried to forge itself into some kind of giant polyglot Wehrmacht, right? and so in that sense, I think we have to ask ourselves, are there things that Europe can do in foreign policy that are nevertheless still important, right? Imagine if we did not have interconnectivity in electricity grids and gas mains in Europe right now. Just imagine. If we didn't have that, then Putin would have been able to get us over in an instant because there would have been no alternative to Russian hydrocarbons. There would have been no way to redistribute energy across Europe's economies. So, game over. That's actually quite powerful and significant. We also have NATO, right? And the beauty is the Europeans can coordinate within NATO, which means the United States doesn't just call the shots willy-nilly. And that's important because I hate to break it to you guys, but the United States doesn't always call them in a good way, right? Just look at Iraq and the many gifts that has given us since 2003. So I think we need more European participation at that level. And I think we can get that. Will that violate European sovereignty? No, and maybe that's the problem, right? Maybe Europeans are too obsessed with their own little pet defense industries and projects and whatever. But I think we have to live with the fact that that's the way Europe is. And if Europe can be more resilient, can be more robust, can be more effectively coordinated and work more effectively with the United States in a division of labor that helps to push back not just against Russia, but also against China. And we might talk at some point about how European attitudes toward China are changing in the context of this Ukraine conflict. If we could get that, I think that would help to make the world a better place.
So you mentioned Sweden and Finland joining NATO. Dilip has asked, does that indicate a lack of confidence in the evolving European Defence Union?
No, I think it's realism, right? I mean, think about command control, communications, and intelligence, right? The United States dominates in that area. So you need to work with the United States to be able to coordinate your operations in the field. Think about strategic lift capability. Again, the United States dominates. So it makes sense for the Swedes and the Finns to come in because what they want is American strategic lift to go all the way up to the border of Finland, right? I mean, we pretend we're going to do that with Estonia, so we better pretend we're going to do that with Finland. And in that context, I think it's important that we show the capability. And by the way, if we can do it for Finland, then that makes Estonia safer as well, right? So I think that this is all about creating a European strategic and defense identity, but within a context where there's one global superpower that's going to help, right? And I don't say that as a kind of yay, hooray, America's great, because I lived through the Trump administration, right? And I worry about what's coming down the pipeline. I don't like this situation, but this is the situation we have.
Thank you. Can I just now turn to Fabian? Obviously, we'd like to hear your views on the evolving EU's defence capability. And I'd like to ask a very specific question. If I was Latvian or Lithuanian, should I have confidence in the EU's response so far, or should I actually be worried?
So I think firstly, I would like to address a myth that somehow this is about replacing NATO, replacing the American role with a European role. I don't think anyone is seriously talking about that anywhere. This is about creating complementarities and, in a sense, also addressing the I think, right demand from the United States that Europeans will have to take more responsibility for their own security. And I think that is also the context in which we should see the Swedish and the Finnish decision. That's the context in which we should see also the Danish decision. Let's not forget that Denmark actually voted with a 2/3 majority to stop its opt-out from security arrangements at the European level. These are not in contradiction with each other. These are complementary. And when it comes to dealing with this situation, then the reality is that we have to act on so many different fronts in so many different ways that the general concept of security as narrowly being defined as how many tanks you have in how many different places doesn't work. We will have to address dependencies, for example, on energy. That is not something NATO can do. That is not something where the United States will have a major role within the European Union. We have to address questions around common procurement, around how we organize defense sectors in a different way. We have to address questions around membership. I mean, right at this moment in time, there's a discussion around Ukraine's membership. Why? Because it also has a security component. And clearly that is seen in Ukraine. That is one of the reasons why Ukraine does want to be a candidate country and eventually a member state of the European Union. So these are intermixed issues which cannot be separated very easily and shouldn't be separated very easily. So if I look at this from the Latvian and Lithuanian point of view, of course, there are some things which some countries have also publicly complained about. They would like to see more. They would like to see certain member states also stepping up to the plate. But overall, when you actually look at the response, there has been a remarkable unity, a remarkable amount of decisiveness when it comes to what is being done in the short term. But my real worry is not about the short term. My real worry is about what is going to happen in 6 months' time, in 9 months' time, when we have to face some of the structural decisions, some of the more long-term decisions, when we have to set strategic goals. That's when unity is going to be strained, unity within the European Union, unity with Ukraine, unity with the US, because those are the much more complicated and the much more difficult questions to be addressed.
Thank you. I smile wryly that 6 to 9 months is now no longer considered short term, but it's long term. We can see what sort of world we're living in at the moment. You want to just respond briefly, and then I'll come to Claire.
I just wanted to say this point that Fabian made about the security element of EU membership is worth underscoring. Because in the Treaty on European Union, there's a clause that was lifted from an original treaty that was drafted in 1948 for the Brussels Treaty Organization, a treaty that was meant to provide security for West European countries against the threat of German remilitarization, right? And the language in that treaty was unbelievably strong. Any attack on any member state will be regarded as an attack on them all, and they're all obliged to do anything in their capacity to respond. By contrast, the treaty that was written a year later, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Treaty, the NATO treaty, says that any attack on any member state is regarded as an attack on them all, and each member state will decide to respond with the means it believes to be appropriate, right? So when you think of the contrast between what has crept its way into the Lisbon Treaty from 1948, right, boilerplate, you have, if Ukraine comes in, a firm commitment to do everything you have in your capacity to protect Ukraine against Russia. That does not exist if Ukraine were to join NATO, for example. So that security component that Fabian alludes to is quite significant, at least in treaty terms.
Thank you. Claire, obviously, I want to hear your views on the evolution of defence capability in the EU, but also specifically the implications for the UK, in that there is every chance that we will be excluded from the massive procurement that will follow.
Well, first of all, on the confusion between what's short-term and long-term, I do appreciate there's great excitement about today's announcement about Ukraine. But you know, if you want to know short term and long term, it's likely to take a decade before they're anywhere near getting in. So if they have to wait for that to join the EU, for the EU to protect them, they're in for a while, right? I mean, this is not an organisation that's stealthy, to say the least. Its lack of flexibility takes some beating. Ask the others ahead of them in the queue. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I mean, look, because I feel anxious about the fact that I'm not interested politically in spending my life critiquing the EU. I am interested in what's happening in Europe, which is different because, you know, I'm not an obsessive EU hater. I didn't want the UK to be in the European Union. This is a different set of priorities. And I am interested in the fact that there's been some slippage within the countries who are in the EU. There's been massive changes. I mean, Germany is now militarising. This is a huge shift from what has happened in the past. That should be of interest to us all. It might be of some concern, but it might be of some joy. Whatever it is, it's massive. It's a major change. President Macron, who we have to remember, you know, only in the French elections, in the first lot, the presidential elections, you know, we had almost like a direct EU intervention into those elections with Costa, Sanchez and Scholz's letter in Le Monde actually saying that, you know, everyone should vote for Macron to defend our common European values, and great excitement that he got elected as the president. Although the recent elections would indicate that's not quite as secure a position, and actually, if anything, he was humiliated. Something else is going on, as it were. That populist moment has not quite worked, and Macron may have got the presidential elections, but he's not a popular guy. But in the meantime, is he the reliable ally for Ukraine? And some people will say he's playing the right decision to go and talk to Putin. That's an argument, you know, that's a pragmatic thing. The point I'm making is, for people in the UK, we should be looking at what the nation states are doing as much as what the EU is doing. Whether there should be an EU military force, whether the EU should be seeing itself as a military power, as a military force in that way. I mean, there was something which I thought was misinformation, by the way, when amongst people on the leave the EU side, where people would say, oh, there are people in the EU federalists who want a European army. And I always thought it was a bit scaremongering to say that. And I still think those kind of things were a little bit over the top. But what I would say is that if you were to have the notion of a kind of European army, I'm not saying that's exactly what's being suggested, but I do know that some people are at the moment talking about it, requires that you have a sense of European citizenship that will collectively say that they'll join the European army. We heard earlier in that fascinating opening session, or the second session on Ukraine, that one of the things that's really marked out Ukrainian resistance to the brutality of the Russian invasion is their absolute passion for their nation and for their nation state. And it's almost like they've gone superhuman because they believe in what they're doing. And it seems to me that there's a deficit at the heart of at the heart of European citizenship, which I don't think it has any content. I think in the end, you will fight for France or you'll fight for Germany or what have you. And the only counter to that is the very important point that Margaret Macmillan made, which was really this war between Ukraine and Russia is a war about the West, right? And the West is not a geographic entity. It's not confined to the EU. It's not those people who are in the EU or out of the EU. It involves America, it involves Australia. It's the West, Western values. And I'm very much on the side of the West and Western values. And you don't need to be in the EU to want to fight for that. So therefore, the idea that we need the EU to fight off the threat of Putin, I think is completely misplaced and not appropriate even.
So thank you for that. Just picking up on the point about UK being cut out of any defence procurement, this is one of the consequences of Brexit. How do you respond to that? And relatedly, and I don't know if the others want to have an answer to this question, and more positively, what about reconstruction of Ukraine in a post-war world?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, on the procurement point, I mean, it just feels, I don't know, it feels slightly technocratic to care. I mean, it might well be that we'll be cut out of that, but of all the things that I'm worried about at the moment, it's not been cut out of some procurement deal. I mean, I just think there's so much at stake at the moment that you don't want to, I mean, it just feels petty to me. It might well be, yes, that might be a consequence. Just on the reconstruction, I hope that there will be a Western effort to do everything it can to help Ukraine in its reconstruction bid. And I don't think, again, look, you can say all sorts of things about the UK government, and God knows I do. And I'm no fan, remotely, of Boris Johnson or the Tories. I just wanted to leave the European Union. It was as simple as that. I didn't realise it was going to turn me into an international pariah in my own country, right? And everyone was going to kind of think I was all sorts of... I just voted in a referendum that was called by the government. You know, I thought it was a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But the point about this government is I could spend hours waxing lyrical on what is wrong with them, right? Believe me. But as it happens on Ukraine, not bad. Do you know what I mean? I don't care why he's doing it. I don't care whether he's doing it for any... I don't care. Not bad. And I think that there is something in the fact that Zelensky has made that point, and people should be gracious enough to say that. I mean, you know, the UK is doing well, and I hope that the UK is one of the leading forces in the reconstruction of Ukraine. But sadly, we've got a long way to go till then.
Yeah, thank you. Do either of you want to say anything on the reconstruction of Ukraine point? Go on, Fabian.
I wanted to pick up a couple of points and then also comment on the reconstruction. But I think it's interesting when we talk about the European army, when we talk about European democratic legitimacy, that there the EU is seen as a major problem, but nobody actually talks about NATO and what democratic legitimacy that cooperation has. I'm fully in favor of NATO, so don't get me wrong, but I think there are different standards being applied to different types of cooperation. But I don't think that in any case we are talking about a nation-state army. We're talking about cooperation between nation states, exactly the same as we have cooperation between nation states within NATO. And I don't see why that is in any way a contradiction. But what I do think, and I say that also as a German myself, if you look at the remilitarization of Germany, I am very glad that Germany is in the European Union and that within Germany, there is no question that that kind of policy development has to be seen within the context of European integration. I would be far more worried if Germany was doing this on its own without having those kind of cooperations and controls in place. On Ukraine, of course, Ukraine knows that this is not an instantaneous process of joining the European Union, but maybe we can also give them credit and not only listen to what Zelensky says if it suits our narrative. What Zelensky and the Ukrainian government is saying very clearly is they want to be in this process, they want to be recognized to be in this process, and they want to have the clear political signal that they belong to Europe. So I think it is exactly the right thing that we're giving that signal. And yes, we have to also then have a realistic discussion around how is that process going to work, how long is it going to take, and that is also the context in which I would see the reconstruction of Ukraine. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that the vast majority of the funding for the reconstruction is going to come from European Union countries. It will have to come from European Union countries. The vast amount of the reconstruction of the economic fabric of Ukraine has to be seen in the context of economic integration with the European Union. It doesn't make sense in any other way. So this is an enormous task, and we will also have to help the Ukrainians to rebuild institutions, to rebuild infrastructure, to rebuild the controls which are necessary in a democratic country to also deal with issues such as corruption. And we have to do all of that with a high likelihood that there's some form of ongoing conflict or certainly ongoing instability in parts of the country. So this is an enormous task, and all of the world will have to work together to achieve this. But I think the greatest burden, without any shadow of a doubt, will fall on European Union countries.
Yeah, thank you. Erik.
Two things really quickly. First, we had an opportunity to help Ukraine rebuild after the Orange Revolution in 2003, and we didn't take it. Second, we had another opportunity to help Ukraine rebuild after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and we didn't take it. So I believe that there's a lot of goodwill to take that opportunity now. Whether we really get that opportunity remains to be seen, but I'm not holding my breath. The only thing that's got me completely obsessed is the impact on world food prices if we don't act. And this is the second point I would make. I think Claire made a really important point about this being a thing about the West, right? And the West standing together with Ukraine. But if you go to the global South or if you go to the East, their narrative about what we're doing is totally different. They accuse us of provoking this conflict. They accuse us of ensuring that the conflict is destabilizing world energy and food prices. And as this conflict gets worse, we're going to have a huge public relations campaign with these other parts of the world that we're going to have to deal with. If we don't pay attention to that, then I would not be surprised to find that at the end of this conflict, we're the villains and not the heroes of the peace.
Thank you. My final block of questions, and a number of them have come in on Slido, is essentially about the EU's neighbourhood policy and how it's going to manage, dare I say, improve its relations with its neighbours. Of course, on one side you've got the UK and Switzerland, but you've also got those who are in the EEA and those who are just south of the EU, so North American countries. We know that Macron has tentatively proposed something fairly imaginative. Do you think there is any prospect of that working? And do you think the EU would accept some sort of looser confederation? And do you think those countries would accept being members of some sort of looser confederation? Fabian, do you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I think firstly, our neighborhood policy in the broadest sense has already changed fundamentally and will continue to change fundamentally. There is no prospect in my mind which would have been there for Ukraine membership before Russia's invasion. Now we are just about to grant candidate status, so that already is a major change. With that candidate status, we are extending the same to Moldova. Again, this would not have happened before the invasion. We are talking about the Caucasus, which many people would have thought will never happen, would never even be considered. And this is also leading to a new debate on the Western Balkans, where the European Union, in my view, has made a strategic mistake over the last years by leaving the Western Balkans essentially to the influences of countries like Russia and China, rather than seeing this as a strategic priority. So we are going to have to rethink how we interact with accession countries. We have to rethink the enlargement process because it cannot work the way it has done before. And that also means making changes within the European Union. The enlargement process has always been, and some might even argue it's even more about what happens within the EU rather than what happens in the candidate countries. It is about putting the reforms in place which make the EU work effectively, also when it comes to certain challenges which have come with enlargements. Apart from that, we also have the redefinition of our friends, neighbors, allies, enemies, because we also will have to think about what is our long-term relationship with Russia. How is that going to look like, both economically and politically? So all of that is in the mix at the moment. I think what I would conclude at this stage And I think it is a moving target. We will see a lot more changes in the next years. But what I would conclude at this stage is that it certainly has unblocked certain discussions, but it has also re-emphasized what the European Union can actually provide. So the question of having some form of affiliation with the European Union is seen by the vast majority of neighboring countries as essential and not optional. So we will have to think about how we organize that, what kind of involvement that means in different policies, whether it means economic integration, political integration, or both. But these are all questions which now will have to be answered. And we are going to see also a big challenge in that, because for those countries which want to join the European Union, they have to recognize that the European Union has become a moving target now. The changes are so profound within the European Union that we are going to see a continuing mismatch between what is happening in some of the candidate countries and what is happening within the EU.
Okay, thank you very much. Erik.
So the neighborhood policy was created in the early 2000s to bring together our conversations initially about Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine, but then it extended around, and it was laying alongside an enlargement strategy that included the Western Balkans, but also extended to Turkey. And the difficulty with this policy is that it never really worked the way it was supposed to work. As a result of which, we didn't stabilize those countries in the east, we didn't stabilize those countries in the south, and we never really figured out what we wanted to do with Turkey. And as a consequence, and I think Fabian is absolutely right, we made a strategic decision in the Western Balkans not to pursue enlargement aggressively, and that was arguably a mistake, right? So now the question is, how do we rectify this 20 years of accumulated negligence or neglect? And the answer for right now is, wow, the big problem is in the east, because that's where the Ukraine war is. That's where the Moldovans are absorbing all these refugees. There are all these people coming into Poland. We need to figure out how we're going to settle them and rebuild their economy so we can send them back. But next autumn, we're going to get another wave of migration from sub-Saharan Africa and from the Maghreb. And so it's a big walk and chew gum at the same time problem. We're going to be facing so many different crises. And let's face it, our relationship with Turkey has not improved along the way, and we've got to fix that. So I think I'm grateful that there's this political momentum to recognize the seriousness of the issue, but I'm worried that this political momentum is subject to profound distraction when the next crisis emerges in 6 to 9 months.
Okay, thank you.
One thing that is really interesting at the moment is that kind of shift towards suddenly looking at the East, which has obviously happened. I mean, beyond the kind of neighbourhood policy as a policy. Because if you consider at the moment, Poland is almost being considered as heroic. It's taking in all of the Ukrainian refugees. I mean, actually, Hungary is as well, but it's harder for them to be embraced as heroic. But I mean, Poland has, within the EU, often been treated as a basket case, right? And Hungary too. I mean, I've found that very difficult, because it doesn't matter what I think about what the Polish voters vote for or the Hungarian voters, because I believe in sovereignty. Remember that one. But certainly while I was in that brief time that I was in the EU, but even before, because I've been interested in Eastern Europe in particular, the contempt with which they were discussed in public by the EU for their flaunting of the values of the EU and the fines and the threats and what they themselves would describe as demonisation, meant that there was always this sort of unhappy relationship in relation to the East. Anyway, things have changed, right? Things have now changed. And then you've got those neighbourhood countries, as it were, now where everyone, Fabian rightly says, perfectly reasonable, that Zelensky wants to be part of the process of joining the European Union. These other countries do too, right? And I was merely making the point it's not going to be fast. But it's also the case that you felt as though they were in some kind of endless waiting for Godot room, you know, that it was never going to happen for a lot of people. So I think that there is a shift eastward, and it will have to, the European Commission will have to think a little bit. I mean, I was very distasteful that they were still issuing the fines to Poland and Hungary in the midst of the crisis. But anyway, they might have to think a little bit about toning down the rhetoric in terms of attacking the East. That's one thing. Just in terms of the other point that was made, though, I'm absolutely... I mean, the migration crisis is going to be a big crisis for the EU. I mean, we already know it's a source of huge tension here in the UK. And obviously, Turkey was used as the country. I mean, there's lots of upset here about the Rwanda situation. I was, prior to this, the Rwanda situation, outraged at the outsourcing of migration by the EU to Turkey and the camps of Turkey, or the camps of Libya, right? I mean, you know, it hasn't been there's an iron ring around the EU when it comes to migration of non-Europeans. Freedom of movement only extends to Europeans, you know, not those other people. And they've kind of all been shoved away. Well, there's going to be a much bigger crisis coming up. And I think, therefore, as if I can say it once more, I think the EU is not the organisation that has the flexibility that can deal with these problems, but certainly problems they will have. For me, however, these are European problems that extend beyond the EU. They are Western problems that are like, we are now seeing the greatest shake-up of geopolitical change. You know, this is the one. We're living in the history bit, right? People thought Brexit was big. Nothing, right? This is a big shift. We're on the start of something. And there's all to play for, a lot, when we might not win, as it were, not just in terms of a technical war with Russia. There's a lot going on. So I would prefer to agree with Fabian. The EU aren't that bothered about Brexit, and they should basically sort out the protocol as quick as possible and get rid of the UK from the European Union. The UK should get out of the orbits of the EU totally, and if that requires a protocol bill, all to the better, because it will be necessary. But the big problem we all face is not whether the EU or the UK are having a fight over Brexit, but what we as nation states of the West are going to do about the much bigger problems that face us down the line.
Thank you very much for that. Now, just before we finish, I am conscious, and this is what Slido tells me, there is the most popular question that has come in, and you have, I will time you, less than 5 seconds to answer it. Does the panel agree with Lord Frost's claim this morning that the world will judge the EU harshly for its mistreatment of the UK?
No.
OK, thank you. Fabian?
Utter nonsense.
Thank you. Claire?
The world will cheer that the UK took a decision democratically and stuck with it. And that's what history will remember from the Brexit period. And hurrah for that.
No, I said 5 seconds. You've already had it. So, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, many thanks indeed for the wonderful questions that have come in via Slido, both from the audience here and online. Huge thanks to our wonderful panel who have fielded a remarkable range of questions. Please don't disappear, because there is going to be a magnificent session at 3 o'clock, a question time style session with indeed people who have appeared on Question Time, so they know what a gruelling experience it is. And in the half an hour you've got between sessions, please make sure you read our report, which was published today on Europe. Thank you very much indeed. See you in half an hour.
Thank you.